Hello, here is Wirtschaft, Information and Meinung, German-English mixed introduction, and I'm a little bit excited. I have here Rupert Darwall. He wrote a book called The Green Tyranny, and he knows a lot about the topic. Please introduce yourself to my viewers. Welcome on my show. Why are you an expert in this topic? Let us know a little bit about yourself before we go into the topics we prepared.
Sure, Jürgen. Really good to be joining you. I'll give you a little bit of a back history as how I got involved in this whole field of global warming and environmentalism, because it isn't something that I have ever expected to do. I studied economics at Cambridge University a long time ago, and I didn't actually rate the economics that they taught me very much. And there was an incredible economist called David Henderson who did what were called the Reith Lectures on the BBC in the mid-1980s. And then I was very struck. I thought, gosh, this is an economist who really talks sense, everyday sense. And then decades later, I met him, and he had got into the whole area of corporate social responsibility and environmentalism. And we got talking about global warming, and more I was just filled with the sense of absurdity of it all, and the world was going in the wrong direction. And he sort of induced me to write a book. And the first book came out in 2013. It was called The Age of Global Warming, A History. And as a result of that book, I was contacted via my publisher by someone with great depth and knowledge of the situation of German history and developments, and also Swedish. And he said about my first book, this is one of the best books I've read on the subject, but being English, I had missed out the continental European dimension. And he took me through the evidence, and the evidence I found bore out what he said, that there is indeed a Swedish and an important German angle to the development of this. And so that's how the second book, Green Tyranny, came about. And the way I put it is that green tyranny takes one up the dark side of the mountain, but at the top, you reach the same summit of the mountain, essentially. So the two books are complementary.
What I found most interesting, and I think what the leftists hate most, that you say this green movement has roots or parallels in the Nazi time, in the time of the 30s and 40s of the last century. Can you elaborate a little on that topic? Where are the parallels there?
Yes, certainly.
Please.
In my first book, I touched on this, and I thought this is a bit sensationalist, and yes. I tried to downplay it. But when I was confronted by the evidence, I felt I could not ignore it. And virtually everything you find of the modern environmental movement, you find a precursor in the 1930s in National Socialism. Not all of National Socialism, because there were, if you like, people who were what we call now dark greens. But there was a very strong trend of what we would now call environmentalism. And I think there's something deep in German culture which we can discuss, and you can perhaps educate me on, which is almost, shall we say, schizophrenic or bipolar, because on the one hand, German power in the world is based on its success in the Industrial Revolution, the second Industrial Revolution. It is iron, coal, iron, steel, electricity, chemicals, and so forth. That is the basis of, and it's also why Germany German engineering. I mean, German manufacturing exports. It's the highest percent of any country's economy. I think, including China. It's absolutely, Germany's performance as a manufacturing country is stupendous. Yet at the same time, there's this culture within Germany of rejection of industrialization, that industrialization has taken us out of nature. It's destroyed our relationship with nature. We really belong in the forests and the soil, and we need this purity and go back to purity. And so there's this extraordinary tension. Of course, the Nazis used German power, but at the same time, there is this trend of not liking industrialization. So it's not just that Germany, the Nazis happen to be the first political party anywhere in the world with a wind power program. That happens to be a historical fact. But the stuff like the anti-meat eating campaigns that the Nazis practiced, that they wanted to preserve forests and hedgerows and so forth. There was a very, very strong environmentalist trend in Nazi thinking, and one can relate it also to the racial sphere of this belief in racial purity and so forth. And the Nazis were the first party to elevate, if you like, the laws of nature over the laws of men. And this is a big contrast with, say, Marxism, because Marx, the historical laws were human laws, they were economic laws, whereas the Nazis elevated the commands of nature into, nature, the Darwinian struggle and so forth. So there's that. I think the other thing those are the antecedents, but I think the big thing is this purely of historical interest? Is this just, if you like, historical archaeology of digging something up from the past? And I would say no, because when you look at the formation of the Die Grüne in 1980, where did these people come from? Well, they came from two, if you like, two streams. One is the old Nazis and the ex-Nazis, and I document that in the book. And the other is the far left, the 1968ers, and the followers of the Frankfurt School of Marcuse and so forth. And you look at where these people, their ideology, and in the book I quote a very important, it's now a book by a New York liberal intellectual, Paul Berman, who talks about I think he calls it the passion of Joschka Fischer. It's a very, very fine essay. And he talks about how the new left in Germany started out as a reaction against National Socialism and then turned out Nazi-like. And he cites the Baader-Meinhof, the terrorism, the hijacking that resulted in Jewish and Israeli passengers being segregated and were getting murdered. And he said, so here the new left started out against National Socialism and ended up Nazi-like. And I add to that, not just in the things that Berman talked about, but also their embrace of environmentalism.
So you mentioned the wind power program,
yes,
and the vegetarian thing.
Yeah.
Do you know more about those topics? Because this is very new. As a German, I heard a lot of German history and in school and movies and so on. But the wind power program, I never heard of. I knew that Hitler, that he himself didn't eat meat. This I've learned. But do you have any information about those two topiks with this wind power program and
sure. I mean, there was a wind power program. There was a Nazi called Franz Lavacek who was very keen on the wind power program, and it became part of the Nazi program for government in, I think it was the March 1933 Reichstag elections. And 6 weeks after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, at dinner, he was telling his guests, wind, power, wind and tide are the future. And so this wasn't just a sort of, you know, just a sort of little thing they had. It was a belief. It was something they couldn't do much about because they wanted to dominate Europe. They wanted to conquer Europe, and you can't do that with wind power. But it was definitely an impulse in National Socialism. And you mentioned vegetarianism and Hitler being a vegetarian. Goering attacked cattle farmers being anti-patriotic.
Cattle farmers. Okay.
Because you needed to farm vast acreages of grain to feed the cattle. And so this isn't, and Hitler, I think one of the most telling things to me was that there's a quote that Hitler once told of one of his staff. He said, I'm not interested in politics. I'm interested in changing lifestyles. Mm-hmm. And there's another thing, that why nationalize industry when you can nationalize the people? And this is where I think, and at the end of the chapter on the Nazis, which is called Europe's First Greens, there's some quotes from some historians saying that National Socialism wasn't an inevitable outcome of modernity, but it is a possibility within modernity. And it is this that I think is most worrying to me about that episode, is that there is this potential that, and we see it today, that the control of people's lifestyles, you must conform and live in this way, otherwise you're going to risk the future of the planet. And that's why at the beginning of the book, I think I have a quote about the importance of freedom. One should not sacrifice freedom. The basic, I think freedom under the rule of law is highest political value. And when alarm bells should start ringing, when you start saying we must take away people's freedom for reasons of the state or to save the planet or whatever.
Mm-hmm. We have a long list. I have some. I would have some questions. I probably keep it. Oh, probably yes. I sometimes think. I mean, do you think those environmental reasons where to have this nationalist this Nazi regime, they simply put it aside in the 30s, 40s because it worked like that. They had their power and they did not. Today I have the impression, to start a new sentence, today I have the impression that this is put as an that they just put it in front, the environmentalism, to control. Their real aim is to control and to have less freedom, and they simply disguise it in a nice way, like here in Germany and even the Merkel. There's a statement, she wants to reduce the carbon oxide 40% in the European Union, and she simply wants to raise the taxes to unbelievable heights.
Your question, Jürgen, is with the Nazis, was the green stuff just a mask, if you like, to say we want to control? Mask. I don't think it was. I think it was a belief. I think it was actually part of the Nazi ideology. And it's not just Nazi ideology, as I mentioned earlier. It's something to do with the German Geist. It's something to do with German culture and this radical rejection of industrialization, but at the same time, Germany's reliance and the Nazis' reliance on industrialization. I mean, one of the things that I talk in the book is because the Nazis had a policy of energy independence. Energy, we know a lot about it, but they were the first country to have a policy of energy independence. And if you remember, there was going to be synthetic fuels, and they put tariffs on imports of petroleum. And Germany had one of the lowest levels of car ownership anywhere in Western Europe. It was incredibly hard. It was incredibly expensive to run a car. And this meant that actually the Wehrmacht had to rely on lorries that were designed by General Motors. They had to, so completely. But of course, when it became a question of Germany, the Hitler regime having to win the war, everything was put into winning the war. But yes, I think the environmentalism was a very important part of the Nazi ideology. Mm-hmm. And incidentally, one that was in the Bundesrepublik until 1980 or until the mid 1970s was completely rejected. What emerged with West Germany was a completely different. In fact, if you like, West Germany was the most American in terms of culture of any Western European nation. I think it's quite different now. It's a kind of schizophrenic, but at the same time, I think that not all Germans like to be in nature. They have their smartphones. They sit inside and make their plans, and you don't never see the Antifa hiking. I never saw that. They are in the big cities, and they're strong. Yes. They're strong. Yeah, you laugh. I mean, that's the theory we were just talking about. So they're more urban, kind of. It's a kind of urban thing. There are many things that play into it. And it's really schizophrenic because. Or it is probably a plan to crush down the German economy. I mean, you're sitting there in England, right? And there were plans after the war or before to crush down Germany in different plans. I don't want to mention all those. It was the American Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, and it's called the pastoralization of Germany, to turn Germany into a purely, get rid of, and of course that's in a way that would be the perfect solution. Agricultural nation Germany, perfect solution. The Green Party would be happy. Yeah, exactly. Completely mad, insane.
Okay, what you have also expertise in. How do the big money? How does the big money play into it? What do they have? Because everywhere they call, we have to. The capitalism is bad and so on, but at the same time, the green movement and the very big money, they work together. How does that all? How does this all work? I mean, they're like there's a man who ran as president in the U.S., Al Gore. He has this company with the carbon oxide certificates and so on. How does this all play together?
I think the most important chapter in the book, and we've talked about the Nazi chapter, but it's actually the next chapter, which is about activists and intellectuals, and I think my favourite economist is Joseph Schumpeter, the great Austrian economist, and he said capitalism is the only form of society that pays its enemies to bring it down, and I mentioned the Frankfurt School, the Frankfurter School, and they were a group of very radical Marxists that set up their own school in Frankfurt in the 1920s, 1930s. They were the product of capitalism. This was someone's father. I can't remember. His father was a very successful merchant, and he put his money into this post-Marxist school. In the United States, you have these very large foundations like the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, which is the product of petroleum interests of Exxon. And these foundations are huge. They've got billions and billions of dollars. And so, for example, the Rockefeller brothers paid for the Frankfurt School to go back to West Germany after the Second World War. And these foundations have been, they started off being sort of for free markets and capitalism, but then their heirs, they got captured by the left. And the environmentalism has been a very, very big thing for these huge American foundations, and they have poured money into their own battles in the United States, but also the journalist Vivian Krauser in Canada has shown how money has gone into Canada to fight tar sands and pipelines, but foundation money has also gone into Europe through the European Climate Foundation. And so these are huge, if you like, multi-billion-dollar corporations who don't have to earn a profit. They just sit on all this capital and they just allocate it in the ways that are most disruptive to capitalism. And then you have, in the United States, you have the Silicon Valley billionaires. And as we know, that they have made huge amounts of money through capitalism. And they say, well, we believe in a post-industrial society, that global warming is evil, that the hydrocarbon economy on which American is based needs to be closed down. And so they are also aligned with these, with the older foundations. Then you have all the billions of dollars that come from government funding into climate research. So you have universities and academics and NGOs who are all taking money from the, and so when you add it together, and then they have their allies in the press, in journalists. And again, there's a chapter where I can't remember his name, but he was an eminent German civil servant who talks about how environmentalists in the government need to use the journalists in the press. So this, if you like, together constitutes what one can call the climate industrial complex. And then you have all the vested interests in terms of the investors in wind farms and in solar farms. And this is a huge, if you like, or ecosystem, a huge, enormous ecosystem.
Kind of. I wonder what drives people what drives billionaires to they earn a lot of money, and what are their, one more time, what are their precise where do they earn money? One more time, I didn't catch that. Where do they? Where does the Rockefeller foundations or funds, where do they earn money? They don't do.
They don't earn. They have money invested in the stock market.
Okay.
So
it's
these are the
purely
products.
Ideology, in that sense.
You have, so the Rockefellers were. It's inherited money, and then the sons and the grandsons who then run the money. They sit on all this wealth, and they say, well, we're not going to make more wealth, we're just going to spend our wealth.
They're bored. Okay.
Yeah, because they have inherited the money, and we've inherited money, and we're now going to save the world, we're going to purify the world.
Okay. So if we address the Rockefellers, Mr. Rockefeller, Mrs. Rockefeller,
third or fourth generation,
and all those people. Hey, we don't want you to help us. We will also want to have capitalism. You enjoyed capitalism to gain a lot of money. We don't want your rules. We want to live on our own rules that we give to ourselves.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
So
I think for people like I talk a lot about Eric Schmidt, who was the chief executive of Google. For the Silicon Valley billionaires, how do you justify from the attacks from the left that actually you're an okay person? You say, well, I'm using my money to save the planet. It's the best defense against attacks from the left.
So okay.
And also, if you make lots of money out of, okay, you invest in wind farms and solar, okay, I have got rich, but I'm saving the planet. Well, that's, you know, you're doing good and you're making money at the same time. You know, what's not to like?
Yeah, that's great. But there are also freedom of speech and so on.
But those are just things for deniers and people who can't see the truth.
Who don't see the good thing in it. Okay, yeah, I understand. How does the Club of Rome play into it? This you have also done research on Club of Rome, I understand, and
yes, that was very much that was more in the first book, The Age of Global Warming, and the way I see it, that there were two environmental waves, and the first environmental wave began in the early 1960s with what I think is publication of the most important book of the post-war period, and that was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And incidentally, when we talk about the legacy of the Nazi period, the most impactful chapter in Silent Spring was called 1 in 4. It's the cancer chapter. And the largest number of citations came from a German-American doctor who worked in Germany during the Nazi period, essentially saying cancer is a disease of industrialization. That was a key belief of Nazi medicine, that industrialization causes cancer. And that is fed, you find that reproduced in the cancer chapter of Silent Spring. Anyhow, Silent Spring came out in 1962. And it had a huge impact. It relaunched the environmental movement in post-war America. And so you see this, and the Club of Rome got in the act, and it really peaked in about 1972 when you had books like, I mean, the most famous product of the Club of Rome is Limits to Growth. And Limits to Growth turned out to be completely wrong. It basically said, we are consuming the Earth's resources and the economy is going to collapse. And we've continued to consume and the economy hasn't collapsed.
And you draw a line also from the acid rain hoax to the FCKW, or how can you say FCKW, the global warming gas, not carbon oxide, but FCKW, in fridges and so on, which is in fridges. The
CFCs, the refrigerants.
Yeah. And now we have the climate hoax, in my belief.
Well, acid rain is very, very interesting because, and that brings us to the Swedish angle of it. The Swedes had in the late 1960s, they had a nuclear power program.
One more time, we had a little interruption in the internet, please.
Okay, are you back on?
Yeah. For my viewers, that they will also understand, and I didn't catch the last sentence.
Yeah,
sorry.
Acid rain was developed by the Swedes in the late 1960s because the Swedish government had a very large nuclear power program, which was very unpopular with ordinary Swedes. And so the Swedish government said, if you don't have nuclear power, you'll have coal. And coal, the emissions from coal-fired power stations poison our lakes, they destroy our forests, and they got this onto the international agenda at the 1972 Stockholm UN Conference on the Environment. And shortly after that, they then started on global warming. So One of the other revelations in my book is the first world leader to talk about global warming being a threat or climate change being a threat was Olaf Palme in 1974. In 1974. I say to Americans, 1974, when Al Gore was still at law school, this whole predates what Americans think is the sort of global warming. It started off in Sweden in the early 1970s, and it was part of their battle Swedes to accept nuclear power. And of course, the acid rain crisis in Germany in the 1980s was the hysteria around it was almost greater than with global warming. So you had stuff like forest death. There was a big, scare about forest death, and Germany's forests were going to be wiped out.
Yes, I remember it well. And still, we see a lot of trees in the forests.
Except they're being cut down to make way for wind farms.
And you mentioned that also in the 80s, or I don't know how long that went in the 90s, the scientists also were silenced as today with the climate. I call it hoax. Leftists hate me for that, but still, in the sense that how much has human beings to do with climate? In that sense, I say hoax. But first, before we talk about free speech, probably there's also Greta Thunberg. She's also from Sweden, and her grandpa or grandpa, he received the Nobel Prize for global warming. Svante Arrhenius. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so you learned something today. So, and she's from a very privileged family. This little girl, if you look at 16-year-old girls, they look normally a little different. She looks a little childish with her age, and she's also proposed for a Nobel Prize as her grandpa.
It's very interesting you raise that. I mean, first of all, on Arrhenius, he was one of the founders of. Again, this is a catalogue that Sweden had a racial purity institute.
Had it?
For eugenics.
When?
They had a big eugenics program, and Arrhenius was one of the scientists who was the founders in that. So
wow.
So one shouldn't forget that little bit.
Wow! I didn't know that.
Yeah, they had because in the north of Sweden you have the Sami, or the Lapland people, and there was a lot of racial. They wanted to assert that these people were inferior. So there is Sweden. Sweden is not a country that it appears. There is a dark side to Sweden that, I mean, for example.
One moment, Rupert. One moment. We're talking about the 19th century, and
early 20th century.
And early 20th with Svante Arrhenius, right? And there was this institution. Can you repeat this? I'm really stunned.
Yeah, it was something like the State Institute for Racial Purity. I mean, the Swedes had a eugenics program.
And this Svante Arrhenius was the founder?
Yes, he was one of the co-founders.
Wow.
He was one of the moving spirits.
Really interesting. Okay, please go on. Sorry for...
Well, the other thing I think about Greta Thunberg is it's something, and the use of this teenager who looks like a child, beat about the bush, it is propaganda, is something I quote in the book by the French philosopher Pascal Bruckner, and he says the future has once again become the great category of blackmail. And he points out in Christianity, it's, the afterlife, and in Marxism, it's the classless society, it's the pure communist society. And he says, yet again, the future's become the great category of blackmail. So you can't criticize this child, because what you're doing is you are betraying the future. You are saying you are risking a planetary catastrophe. You are taking the future away from children.
Yes, and you're aggressive against the child.
Yeah, it is absolutely disgusting.
Yeah,
that kind of argumentation.
Yeah, and she's sitting there with Juncker, with in the highest institutions, and many people don't think, wow, how does this all come? How does all this work out? I never was in the European Commission and said something as a child when I was 16. I mean, okay, it was another time. Anyway, so okay, this is the Swedish side of it. So it plays into it.
It's very important to remember that when there are for the Sweden, the the war on coal was about having nuclear power, and to this day, Sweden still has the most nuclear power capacity of anywhere, even more than France. But then what happened, and if you look at the Toronto Climate Conference of 1988, the solution there was nuclear power. Nuclear was going to replace coal. But then what happened? You had the rise of the German Greens. And the German Greens came into being against nuclear power. And that's how we had all the renewables stuff. So nuclear was going to be the answer. And then Die Grünen came along and their campaign against civil nuclear power. And then, of course, in the 1980s, you had their campaign against the NATO missiles, the American, the Pershings and cruise missiles. So that all got bound up together into this hostility to nuclear energy.
Okay.
And I think many of us, if global warming meant, oh well, we just switched to nuclear power and it's all done economically and whatever, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. But it's actually about fundamentally rejecting nuclear power, rejecting industrialization, and changing our lifestyles and so forth.
Yeah, it's not logic. We can't understand it with our logic mind, because we are being silenced. Arguments don't count, and Greta Thunberg, she even once had she tweeted that something about that the atomic coal is not good, but probably could go back to the atomic to how to the expression, I forgot the English expression. So Atomkraft, yes, to go back to go back to it, but they quickly deleted the tweet, or she
that's very interesting.
Yeah, I think not deleted, but they took it back somehow, and it's very confusing. So they really believe that we can survive with wind and solar, or
because I don't understand. Jürgen, I think you're being too logical. I agree with you. I think you're being too logical, because global warming is a pretext. It's a pretext for doing something they want to do anyway. The Greens, if there was no global warming, they would still want to do wind and solar. It is merely, it's an excuse, a pretext.
Okay, probably we do a little psychology here at this point, which is not on my list. What's their logic? I mean, their logic is that they want to do something good. Of course, there are some people also out there who are evil, and they say they are evil, or they are not hiding a lot, but they're. It's all. I mean, how can you hinder someone to rescue nature or to rescue the euro or whatever. I mean, but when they do this e-mobility and stuff, how can they really think that those cars are really that expensive, and there are a lot of resources that we need from Eastern Congo for it, and how can they think that very expensive products are like the e-mobility is in any way more environmental friendly? How can this be?
Because
what's their thinking? You can see I'm very confused about it.
Jürgen, there is none so blind as a green that doesn't want to see that wind farms destroy nature. They destroy bird life. They destroy bats. And as you say, batteries involve huge amounts of plundering of resources from Africa, of rare earths from China. The PV panels are just, when they're finished, where do you put them? You just dump them in the third world or something. There are none so blind as a self-satisfied green. But I think you're right. This is, on one level, there is irrationality, nihilism. I think there's also guilt. There's a sort of projection of guilt,
yes,
which is very...
Especially with Germans.
This is a massive guilt trip. Greta Thunberg gives people a massive guilt trip, and people like that. They like feeling guilty.
Okay.
And then they can say, well, we have sinned, we've got to, And it's also, it's not that politicians feel, they don't personally feel guilt. It gives them a sense of purpose to boss people around, to make speeches and
to boss. Okay, they ought to
just do that. We should just, they should just. It would be much better if we had green churches and we could just push them into a green church.
Yes, like they're praying their global warming church in their little church and leave us alone.
Yes, leave us alone.
Yes.
We don't have to turn up.
I mean, also a message to those environmentalists. I mean, they can live like that if they want. I mean, but as I said, they're most often, those people are most active in urban areas, in the big cities, and not in the rural area, really.
Yes.
That's really interesting for me. And probably my next interview is with a psychologist.
Fantastic. Good call, Jürgen. I like that.
Yeah, that's just an idea that comes up. And now a little about the silencing of voices in the free speech. It's obviously an essential part of all this, that those Greens, they can't accept a different voice, a different opinion. That's obviously part of it. I mean, even now, Eric Schmidt at Google, at YouTube, they have a philosophy of information, free information, and so on. But I'm always under the Damocles sword, or it's always like I'm fearing that my YouTube channel will be closed down, and there were also videos that were not allowed, that were put off my channel and so on. How can they really think they have the best solution if they silence down other people? I mean, you see me confused again.
I think that I cover that. This is, to my mind, in a way, the most important aspect, as you say, is the crushing, the marginalization of dissent, the delegitimization of dissent. And the penultimate chapter of the book is called Spiral of Silence, which is taken from the book of the same name, and you can translate into German by Elisabeth Noelle Neumann. Elisabeth Noelle Neumann was the foremost German pollster, opinion pollster of the post-war era. From Adenauer to Helmut Kohl, I think she advised the CDU. And she also, for a short time, worked in the popular enlightenment and propaganda. I think I can't remember. She worked.
Merkel. Yes. She.
No, Elisabeth Noelle Neumann.
Neumann. Oh, okay. There was also again internet disruption. Sorry. So one more time. Where did you work?
She worked in the Ministry of Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda in the Second World War under Goebbels. This is Elisabeth Noelle Neumann. And she wrote a book called The Spiral of Silence, which is an incredibly powerful and interesting book. And she describes a process whereby views that people hold, even majority views, can be pushed by the state and by media outlets, say you are forbidden to have these views effectively, and eventually these views get pushed out, and they are no longer spoken, and ordinary people no longer have the words to express what they really feel. And this is what she called the spiral of silence. And this is exactly what we see in the climate debate. If you venture an opinion that is not accepted, you are a climate denier. As you say, you are pushed off YouTube, you get taken off Twitter and so forth. This is exactly the process that she described, or she foretold in her book, which I think came out in the 1960s. A really, really powerful book. Again, it's very interesting that a German, if she was an absolutely brilliant woman, and I say it's in the one from last chapter it's the penultimate chapter of Green Tyranny, Spiral of Silence. But that's exactly what we're seeing happen, that views that run counter to the orthodoxy do not have permission to be uttered.
Yeah, they're very aggressive, those leftists, when you have a different opinion. Yeah. Okay.
Aggressive and nasty.
Yeah. Yeah, we're still. Oh, my internet connection. Anyway, but we can hear. Okay, that were my questions. Really, I think we're through. Probably there's a man in the internet, also a YouTube channel, who sells a book called "Liberals Find a Cure." Greens find a cure. So what is the cure? We can advise the green to relax, or to keep to look at they look at their stuff and keep us alone. What's a positive message at the end?
I think the positive message, Jürgen, is that we keep talking and we break the spiral of silence. I think that is far and away the most important thing. So you keep doing what you're doing.
Okay.
And do not let the spiral of silence win, because eventually the truth will prevail. I do feel that if we keep going, the truth will eventually prevail, and we'll wake up one day and the thing will have kind of melted away. We will beat this.
Okay, yes. Hopefully.
Yes, we will.
Okay, thanks, Rupert, for taking the time, and I hope that my viewers also understand the English. I tried to translate probably something.
I
need
wish
some
I
help.
could speak German. I'd love to be able to speak German.
Yeah. Very interesting. I probably at the end I would. How did I came? How did you? How did I find you? I watched a video of yourself, so it's good, as you say. And talking you talking about the parallels of historical parallels. Yes.
Yeah.
So I promise I'll keep doing what I'm doing, and you keep writing books, please, and inform people. Okay. Thanks a lot, Rupert.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jürgen.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.